It's so nice to have you here. I'm going to leave those on just for sorry. I got to fix your It's nice to be back again. I said, as I said it the last time, I thought it would be pretty packed tonight. I don't know if we're all morbid or what it is about us all loving cemetery art, but we do. So just as a matter of background, in my previous life, I was the director of a historical society back east, and I used to teach a couple of courses over at our community college, and one of them was on graveyard art and cemetery art. And I was always amazed because they were pretty packed classes, and I would always go around in a room and ask people why they had come to the class. And, you know, most people say, oh, I'm just interested, I've been interested in a long time, but occasionally somebody would offer me a really interesting line. And one time a person said, I'm here because I'm designing my own tombstone and I want to get ideas. So anyhow, so you all have a handout, I hope, right? With some, okay. So one of the things that many people like to do when they go to old cemeteries is to read the epitaphs. And no matter what cemetery you go to, or graveyard or churchyard, you will find interesting epitaphs. And so these are some that I have seen or read about over the years. On the first page, there is up on the upper left-hand side, the grave is waiting for your body and Christ is waiting for your soul. Oh, may this be your cheerful study. Do be prepared when death doth call. And that is a very common epitaph in New England. You see that a lot in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont. And then the next one down from it, Ransom Beardsley, died January 24th, 1850, age 56 years, 7 months, 21 days, a volunteer in the War of 1812, no pension. I wanted to be sure we got that in. I'm going to be cremated and my ashes are going to be spread in Montana and in Cape May, New Jersey on the Atlantic Ocean. But if I was going to have a tombstone, which I'm not, but this is not the one I would want. And that is for Charles Petty. It's on the next column. His death occurred in 9 hours after being bitten by a shark while bathing near the ship. If you are a pro-death penalty person, then you'll see the next one down here. Dan Dowd, Red Sample, Tex Howard, Bill Delaney, Dan Kelly, legally hanged March 8th, 1884. If you're an anti-death penalty person, then the one below that is George Johnson hanged by mistake. This was one I saw in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania once. Daniel E. Cole, born February 2nd, 1844, went away March 22nd, 1921. I wonder where he went. Another very common epitaph back east is the next, a couple down there, and it says, behold, my friends, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me. Very, very common. You see that a lot in New England tombstones. Farther down the page, another one that I wouldn't want on my tombstone, Andrew C. Ham, born March 12th, 1842. That cherry tree of luscious fruit, I'm sorry, Mark, beguiled him too high. A branch did break and down he fell and broke his neck and died. I mean, who would want that on your tombstone, right? And then on the next column, George Ladders, born October 20th, 1827, murdered in Cincinnati, Ohio. By the way, the Cozads were from Cincinnati, Ohio. I got to get that in. I'm on the clock tonight for the museum. So June 1st, 1862. Here lies an honest man, but an imprudent one. So you have to wonder what he did to deserve to be shot or whatever. Benjamin Franklin, who's buried in Philadelphia. The body of Benjamin Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be lost. It will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more beautiful edition, corrected and amended by the author. if I was to have a tombstone, and I did want to have an epitaph on it, it's the next one down that I really like. The sentiments of it is what I like. So this is from Dr. Dunn. She loved flowers, birds, and music, author of books and many articles, member of various honor societies. She was a great friend, and her friends are legion over the United States. After a full and busy life, she now rests in the majesty of her Lord. Amen. So that's the kind of I would. Farther down, here lies John Shillcutt, an old bachelor. That says something, right? And then the one beneath it, if you were a genealogist, this would be a perfect one for you if you were trying to find out about your ancestor. An American by birth, a German Dutchman by descent, a Republican in politics, a Congregationalist in religion, a druggist by profession, and a bachelor by faith. So, sometimes people want to send a message from tombstones, and on the other column there, this is in Rehoboth, Massachusetts, right in the heart of where many of these have come from. My wife from me departed and robbed me like a knave, which caused me brokenhearted to descend into my grave. My children took an active part and to doom me did contrive. It stuck a dagger to my heart, which I could not survive. Unhappy. Okay. And then the last one is, I really love this one. I don't know why, from Norway and Maine. Asa Barton, aged 54 years. His faults are buried with him beneath this stone. His virtues, if he had any, are remembered by his friends. This is his own epitaph. So, the next couple pages have books or resources that you might be interested in if you want to follow up more on graveyard art and cemetery history. These three cemeteries I mentioned there are from back east where I'm from, and there are certainly great cemeteries here to visit. The Waikuka Cemetery in Lincoln is the coolest cemetery. If you've not ever been there, I don't remember what street that's on. Is it on O Street? Anyway, it's a great cemetery to go to. I would say in Nebraska, it's the best one I've been to so far. And then some of these other sources or books you might just want to, if you're interested in all this sort of thing. Charles Wall's books on epitaphs are where some of mine came from. And if you're interested in restoring cemeteries, in the early decades of cemetery restoration, the English wrote the best books on how to save tombstones and restore them. And now we have come into our own. There's the Association of Gravestone Studies, which is in New England. And that's a group that you can join, as you can see, for $. And then on the last page, as I said, I'm from back east, and so I was very familiar with the laws of the state of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And they do have a very stringent list of things that you can and cannot do with cemeteries. I don't know what Nebraska's situation is, but for example, in New York, if there's an abandoned cemetery, the community that is located within has to take responsibility for it. Even if they disinter everybody and move them to a maintained cemetery, that community has to take care of it. And so the last epitaph, this guy was a good promotional man. Here lies Jane Smith, wife of Thomas Smith, marble cutter. This monument was erected by her husband as a tribute to her memory, kind guy that he was, and a specimen of his work. Monuments of the same style, 300 years. Now, as I am looking around, I have a feeling most of us are either roughly in the same age group. And so some of us are going to remember Edgar Lee Masters. Does anybody remember him? College, high school? No? Very famous American poet. Can't believe that. I thought half of you were going to raise your hands. Oh, I remember that. Okay, just a little bit from Edgar Lee Masters, very famous. He wrote Spoon River Anthology. Does that ring a bell to anybody? Okay, got one. Okay. So the poem is called The Hill. This was part of a very, very famous book, very popular. It was his only best-selling book. Where Elmer, Herman, Bert, Tom, and Charlie The weak of will, the strong of arm, the clown, the boozer, the fighter, all are sleeping on the hill. One passed in a fever, one was burned in a mine, one was killed in a brawl, one died in a jail. One from a bridge toiling for wife and children, all are sleeping on the hill. And where are Ella, Kate, Mag, Lizzie, and Edith, the tender heart, the simple soul, the loud and the proud, the happy one, all are sleeping on the hill. And so that book is filled with those kinds of memories. And then he focuses in on individual people. And the cemetery that he was writing about is the same cemetery where Abraham Lincoln's first love, Anne Rutledge, was buried in Springfield, Illinois. And he wrote this book. He was a lawyer in Chicago, lived in a small Midwestern town, and decided to move on. Okay, so now I think
Just wake it up.
just to wake it up.
Yeah.
How do I do that? I just
Touch a button.
touch any button.
Mhm.
Except that one.
Except that one.
Oh, there it is.
And you just need. Thank you very much. Okay. I think we're going to go. Yes, that would be
Now,
great. Thanks.
can I get
Laura, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a program, and understand it's based back east in terms of my own interest. But as you'll see, as we come farther forward, there's going to be more and more of these burial places that you're going to say, oh, I recognize that style or that kind of place. Oh, whoops. We don't have, I haven't found any of these yet here. And what I'm about to speak on is pretty controversial, but there are many historians, archaeologists who believe that there were people here long before Christopher Columbus, Europeans, and that they were from Iberia and Spain. They were Celts from England. And so we have come to, and I'm interested in this subject, and they're called pre-Columbian. And so these were people that left very little record of their time here, except for stone. Most of the things that they used were animal generated or bones or furs and things, and those are, of course, long gone. But they did leave occasionally things that some people think were burial memorial. So the one on the upper left is what's called a perch boulder. It sits on 5 boulders exactly the same size and dimension. And it's said that a Celtic king might have been buried either underneath or nearby. Now, before you say, well, how could they have moved that kind of stone? If you can imagine them pulling the dirt up, having the 5 stones underneath it at ground level, and sliding the stone up and then pulling the dirt away, that's what you would get. The one on the right is said to have been, at least according to a friend of mine, a burial site for a group of Celts or Iberians, Phoenicians, who came and had a battle in New Jersey. And this is kind of in a very remote area. And there were about 20 of these laying around, and it's thought that they're burial markers. I might also say that the critics of these theories, including a lot of my friends and professional colleagues, say that's a stone where they put, or an area where they put stone to keep the clear fields for farming. I don't know, it's just so neatly laid up, and there are many of them right there. Why didn't they make just one big pile instead of a lot of little? About the one on the left, this was in a place called North Salem, New York. And so it was about 2 hours to drive there. And I took my late wife there, and she was a great doubter in this theory. That's the best I can say. That's the kindest way I can put it. So we get here after a 2-hour ride, and it was a beautiful day. And she said, I said, there's what we're looking for, North Salem, Fort Boulder. And she said, we drove all the way here for that. So anyway, but it's very, very well known back east. So that's pre-Columbian. So that would be before Columbus, Christopher Columbus, 1492, perhaps as old as 2,000 or 3,000 years. Native peoples, and it depends on where you are in America, out in our part of the world here, they often built these kind of platforms, and you can see a body wrap there and would just disappear in time. Custer Battlefield in Little Bighorn and Little Bighorn Battlefield in Montana. These are two monuments that were erected where Native Americans fell during what was called Custer's Last Stand, and then the one up on top, more traditional kind of memorial. Back east, Native Americans are not buried in marked graves at all. The only time you'll see that is when if they were buried in perhaps in a cemetery or graveyard, churchyard that was created as part of a Christian faith. But normally back east, there's no burials whatsoever. So, and this happens here too in Nebraska. Kind of different versions of this. Now, there is a difference between graveyards, cemeteries, and churchyards. So there's a reason, as you'll hear me say, why this term is used. But this is a typical graveyard. And this is in the part of the world where I'm from, and it was about an acre. And the one stone there you can see, it says HD 1713. That was the oldest burial there. And then on the other side, there was another inscription. I think two different people were buried there, and they used the same stone. And you can see it's just cut out of a section in the middle of the woods there. And this person that's standing in the lower right, a friend of mine, he was a descendant of the people from that community graveyard. And that has about 100 or 200 burials. All the slaves of these people, because many of these people were slaveholders, the slaves are buried in a separate cemetery or graveyard outside of this graveyard. The other thing about graveyards is that, and this is a very distinctive feature of graveyards, is it, excuse me, is that the stones all sit in an east-west configuration. Now, if you go to most, like the Cozad cemeteries, not like that. If you went to most graveyards, you would find that they were east-west. So if you put a compass on top of the stones, the monuments, they're all that way. And that's because it was believed that people would rise from the dead and rise towards the east, towards the rising of the sun. Sometimes you'll see one old tree there in that graveyard. Oftentimes, there is fencing around that's long gone. We restored this graveyard years ago, and when we were doing metal detecting around it, we found a barbed wire fence that had been put around it because the barbed wire was still on the ground. But that was probably from the late 1800s. This is another communal graveyard. The people in this little town in Mount Bethel, Pennsylvania, call it a cemetery, but it's really a graveyard. And oftentimes, because these were on the frontier and at the time of, say, the Revolution prior to, there was concern about the native peoples knowing how many people had been killed in a raid, so the graves were not marked, and the grounds were kind of camouflaged to appear as if they might have been smashed. Sometimes landed families in these kinds of communal graveyards would have the faces of the monuments face towards their lands and their properties. If you see close dates, let's just say there's a whole family that dies in April of 1758, then you can be sure there was some kind of epidemic, cholera, whatever that was, and that follows through forward as well. And again, the dimensions are usually about an acre in size, 100 by 100 feet. And oftentimes today, they're right in the middle of a housing tract or in a neighborhood where there's lots of houses around. So this is a communal graveyard up on the Delaware River. And it's at a very historic location. Sometimes graveyards or cemeteries are at those kinds of places. This is right where the New York-New Jersey boundary ended, at least in 1719, about 40 miles north of where it is today. But this is right on the river. And what has happened here is that the ice jams come up from the river, like they do on the flat here, came over the banks and just clipped all the stones right off. And so there are very few stones left. And what they did do, where they knew where people were buried, is they put white metal crosses at each grave. This group, this community at Coshocton, decided to have one monument that had the names of all those families that were buried there that they knew of. So that's what that's the monument that's on the upper right side. And this is called the Curtis Eddy Cemetery. Again, it's a graveyard, but you can see the river there behind it. So certainly, you know, east of the Mississippi, slavery existed until well into the 1800s. New York didn't outlaw slavery until the early decades of the 1800s. And as I said, slave graveyards and burial places are always outside of the owner's graveyard. And so this was a slave burial ground, and you really, if you had walked through there, you would never have noticed those monuments, except for this two that are in this picture. And NW is for Nathan Westfall, and he was the slave of a Westfall family. Yeah. And we were restored. This was the cemetery that was next to the one we were restoring. And when I found these stones, I realized it was now a slave yard. And because of that, there was nothing in the deed in that cemetery for the cemetery, the graveyard. There was a deed, said it was so many feet. We found all the pins for the corners, and we found the wood. One of the trees was still there, and never mentions the slave burial ground, which you can understand was not going to be mentioned. And so I was wandering around there, and I found these two stones, and I realized it was now a slave burial ground. And as I looked closer in the ground, I could see these little stones laid there that were in straight lines, east-west lines, and I realized that it was a slave ground. And so the owner of the property didn't want me there anyway. He was mad that I was even back there, but we were restoring this for a Dutch Reformed church, the other graveyard. So then I said, you know, we have every right to be here. It's a slave burial ground. And if you're going to really give me a hassle, I'm going to call Al Sharpton. And Al Sharpton can come out and he can talk it over with you. That wasn't, he threatened to kill me. It was the only time I've ever been threatened to be killed. He said, I was in Vietnam, I could make you disappear and all this stuff. So I went home that night and I thought maybe this is something I should just not do. And next morning he calls me up and he says, are you the guy who was out here? Yeah. All right, I'll let you measure it, but I'm going to have one of my guys go with you. Because there was no dimensions, we went 5 feet past the last stone. And we thought that then included all the people that were there. But these are very common there in back east and of course in the south especially. Sometimes houses are built, have been built right on top of these burial grounds. This is one of those places. This happened not too far from where I lived in Fort Jervis. There was a historic marker there, has been there since 1930s. That house is a relatively new house, but they built it anywhere right on top of this burial ground. And generally, these burial grounds and graveyards are often at the top of hills in gravelly sections, rocky sections, because you couldn't farm that stuff. And on the top of a hill like that, that was not easy to farm. And so what you find is something like the Hughesville Cemetery, of which all the Hughes family from Hughesville are buried there. And family burial grounds are very common, and that is something that we have in common here in Nebraska. There's lots of those here too. So this is another family burial ground, Durland Burial Ground. And it's almost imperceptible to see this from the road. So many years ago, they were grading, it was a dirt gravel road, we're grading the road, and there was this little bit of a hillish area. And they figured, well, they would just grab some dirt out of there to fill into those. They get into about where that sign was, and they hit a coffin. And it was David Handy, who was one of George Washington's scouts during the American Revolution. When they pulled the dirt away, there was the coffin and the body. So the guy who was operating the front of the loader, I think, got a little worried about that. And so he put the dirt back, and then they put the historic marker and that sign as well. But one of the challenges that happens with these old graveyards is that family, Handy family, is long gone from that part of the world. And there's nobody there to remember that it's there or to maintain it. Here's another one on a road, a side road somewhere I was on one day in Parsberg. The Derlin family, long forgotten. There's no Derlins left anymore in that part of the world. And so, unless somebody's looking out for these monuments and stones and so on, they disappear. Sometimes just pulled out of the ground. Sometimes, I know you're not going to believe this, but in the city of Port Jervis, this is a city of 8,000 people where I'm from, somebody took stones like this and used it for a sidewalk. They flipped the stones over and had the white marble flat part as the sidewalk. So that's what happens because these places are isolated and nobody remembers. One of the things that foreigners, particularly in the 19th century, were amazed at was that Americans buried people in the middle of their farm fields without any markers. And sometimes they did fence them in, sometimes they didn't. This is a famous grave in terms of American literary history that Red Cloud run from. If you remember, there was a man that impregnated Antonia. Remember from My Antonia? That's who this guy is. And on his body, I just love this because here I am talking about it 100 and some years later. On his monument, it says "Gone but not forgotten." That's where he's buried in Red Cloud. So the next kind of category of these burial places are churchyards. I haven't seen too many out here in Nebraska, and I think the reason that is in the early decades of our country's history, churchyards had, or churches had churchyards right next to them. But I think as time went by, that changed as people realized it was not necessarily a healthy thing to have cemeteries right next to churches or other buildings. But this is what a typical churchyard looks like. And these are very common back east. They are usually up to several acres. They represent the local values, traditions, and religious traditions. They are often a veritable who's who of that church or religious institution, who the priests were, who the ministers were, who the leading members of the church. And if the congregation is still active, then they're usually pretty well maintained. So this one here is in Vienna, New Jersey, rural New Jersey, but the church is still active, so the cemetery is maintained, and I think that they're actually still burying people here. It's also important to remember then, and even here in the Midwest, in the early years of the founding of the Midwest, churches were primarily public buildings. So they weren't just used for religious services and things like that, but they were voting places, meeting places, and oftentimes, and you'll see this particularly back east, you'll see a church on a map and all the roads radiate out from it because it was the center of the community. And this is one of those places, the church there at the Martins Creek. Originally, in these kinds of situations, there's no trees, there's nothing. And sometimes the ministers or the leaders of the congregation were allowed to use the adjoining cemetery, graveyard, churchyard to let their cattle or their sheep or their cows, whatever, to forage. In some cases, in some churches, and this is a European tradition that began in Europe, members are buried under the church floors. And so John Quincy Adams, two of our presidents, their wives, are buried in the basement of the Quincy Unitarian Church. underneath the ground. And the problem, as you could imagine with that, is that as the bodies decomposed, the air in the church began to smell. So that wasn't always a good practice. And oftentimes a prominent minister or beloved minister would be buried right in front of the pulpit or perhaps in front of the front pew. So that happened quite often. This is a nice churchyard there at Martins Creek. And here's another one in Union Township in New Jersey. These churchyards began, because there were usually services in the morning and the evening, they began to become places where people could wander and picnic in between services. And the eulogies, or the epitaphs, are the kinds, like two of those that I read, that were warnings to either, stay the course, do the right thing, or you're going to wind up in a bad place. And there were many, many monuments that had those. There were also many monuments that had symbols of a heavenly promise, like the crown, finger pointed towards heaven. Symbols like that promoted the next, the good side and the next side of the world. And so this is one of those churches. This is a later churchyard, and so there's a lot of those fingers pointed towards heaven symbols cut on monuments. So this is another graveyard that I was involved with restoring, or churchyard, and this is an interesting case of what happens when the church disappears. And so the original church for this churchyard is in that back corner. I remember the church that was associated with this was the Dutch Reformed Church, and I remember a tornado struck this cemetery. It only hit this cemetery. I don't know what that said about the Reformed folks there in Port Jervis, but it only hit it. Dropped there. There were 2 or 3 300-year-old trees that came down. When I went to the minister and said, we really ought to do something about that because all the original settlers for Port Jervis are buried there. He said to me, I'd like to help you, but our mission is with the living and not with the dead. Do whatever you want with it. So we put together a partnership with the city, our historical plan, and a couple other groups, and cut everything out that was bad. There was one very old tree that is left, still there. The person whose building I was in charge of, was a Revolutionary War veteran, his grave was there. But if you look closely, compare the way these stones are lined to the cemetery, Catholic cemetery behind it. What you'll see is these stones in the foreground are on that east-west configuration, whereas the ones behind that, the monument behind it, are not. They're parallel to the street. And also, there's a lot of field stones here, some marble stones, but a lot of field stones. I was repairing our guy's tombstone one day. It was tilted very badly, so I had completely dug it out of the ground. And somebody was walking over to the Catholic cemetery and called the police and said, this guy is vandalizing the cemetery. So all of a sudden there's 3 cop cars there, and they're like, Peter, what are you doing? Because they all know me. And I said, I'm just trying to fix the stone. And one of the guys, he was a descendant of the guy whose stone I was fixing. Anyway, they said, all right, well, can you just get it back and get it done? And we don't want that lady to keep calling us all day. So some of these graveyards, I think, will surprise you. This is a Moravian graveyard. Now, Moravians are much more common back east in Pennsylvania and New York. And this is a Moravian graveyard in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is in the northeastern corner of Pennsylvania. And if you're not familiar with the Moravian tradition, their monuments are equal sized and they lay flat to the ground, or almost flat to the ground in some cases. And so they not only lay like that, but women are in one section, children are in one section, and married people are in a different section. As you can see, they're all flat. And then the church was right, the Moravian church was right behind it. Shakers, who are also a Christian tradition, have equal-sized monuments that are equidistant from each other. And they're very neat, just as the Shakers were in dress, and their rows are very exact. And some Shaker churchyards only have one stone to commemorate every buried. The Amish do not have plots at all. They just have blank grass. They fill in the ditches every year, or the sunken grass, mow it, and it's not their custom to visit graves regularly. For those of you who wonder about whether these places are haunted, this picture on the left is a little blurry, but you can see this white line on the upper left corner. A friend of mine was with me one night when we were there, and that's a spirit, I think. They thought, who knows? Anyway, that's that. So you've now seen graveyards and churchyards, and you can see what the differentiation in the terms are. Now we're on to cemeteries. So the word cemetery did not come into use for the first time until 1797. And the word came to mean a dormitory of the sleeping dead, or dormitory of the dead or sleeping dead. It's got different variations. In 1825, Dr. Jacob Bigelow in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is near Boston, began to think about designing new burial grounds, ones that would not have that east-west configuration, one that would not be so stark, and one that would be more of a landscape kind of view. So this is typical of what those cemeteries, early cemeteries, looked like. They had lots of roads through them, lakes, ponds, exotic plantings, and almost park-like. And in fact, if you went to Waipuka Cemetery over in Lincoln, or this hillside in Middletown, New York, when they were first formed, you would have thought that they were parks and not cemeteries, because there were not that many monuments there. They tend to be non-sectarian. Any religion person can be from any religion can be born there. The trend spreads across the country very, very quickly. Develop cemeteries. Oftentimes, bodies are taken from old graveyards and churchyards and brought to cemeteries. In some cases, a 6-foot layer of dirt is laid on top of a graveyard, so a new cemetery can be begun on top of the old. Another thing that happened is that people became more health conscious. And so physicians complained about these cemeteries being right in the middle of these communities. And so they began to be pushed out into the farther reaches of the community outside of town. But it was this combination of design. There was a sense of a need for parks in American cities. It's at the beginning of the park movement, as well as being this movement here. Very famous American architecture and landscape architecture involved with that. Andrew Jackson Downing, Calvert Clove, P.F. Hathaway, all begin to get involved in these designs. And some of these cemeteries can be hundreds and hundreds of acres. Waipuka is the best example I can give. That's a huge cemetery if you've ever gotten around it. Often mortgages are taken out to start. Back east, some of the best known, there's Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, which is an amazing place to see. Greenwood in Brooklyn, New York, and Allegheny, Pittsburgh. Those are the 3 biggest cemeteries. They generally have winding roads, beautiful vistas, and no more east-west configuration, and no more kind of dire monuments either. And they become really these beautiful kinds of places for people to not only bury their dead, but to relax on a Sunday afternoon. So this is the Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. Another ad for John Cozad and the Cozad family. Robert Henry's first wife is buried here. But this is one of the streets there at Laurel Hill, Philadelphia. And these are all mausoleums. And as you drive down, it's like you're driving through somebody's neighborhood, you know. But that is a National Historic Landmark, and its designer was John Knockman. And as I say, the stones no longer face east to west. There are these large mausoleums, and people's views of the burial of the dead are very different than they were before. So this is the Laurel Hill Cemetery overlooks the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, and the one on the upper left, not only is that person sitting on his coffin carved in stone, but there's a standing horse behind him as well. And that's what you see when you come into the cemetery. He's right there. The other fellow there is sitting on a chair overlooking the Schuylkill. Nice place to be on the river there like that. And that's the view from there at that cemetery. What you often find in these new cemeteries, particularly in these urban areas, are these elaborate gateways and chapels. So the Eastern Cemetery, look at that gateway. It's a beautiful gateway. The one down the right-hand side isn't quite as imposing, and then there's a chapel there. But in this age now we're talking about the late 1800s, 1870s, 80s, 90s. These kinds of features become more popular and more common. And in some cases, you even find these large towers in the middle of these cemeteries. This is the Mount Hebron Cemetery in Montclair, New Jersey. Another thing that you begin to find in cemeteries are what are called receiving vaults. Now, I have asked funeral home directors for years what they did to bodies and coffins prior to the creation of these receiving vaults. And apparently they just piled them up in the cemetery, put dirt and hay over them, and waited until the spring to bury people. But by the time the cemeteries come into effect, now they have these receiving vaults where they can wait until the spring to bury. In many of these cemeteries, the house becomes part of the deal. The managers are full-time employees, and these cemeteries are hundreds of acres near urban areas. And Laura's going to probably ask me back to do this, but I have another program on graveyard art, forms of art. But this is just a sampling, excuse me, of cemetery and graveyard art. It reaches its peak in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. A lot of Italian stonemasons coming to America, making cut monuments. And then also the one on the left of Mr. Williams there was by a very well-known sculptor from East Pennsylvania. And as I said, this is really, many people have argued that this is the best, the greatest time of cemetery and graveyard art. And you have to imagine these places not being full as they are today, but with an occasional monument here or there. And we have something that are called rural cemeteries, and these are outside of cities and communities. And in this case, Martins Creek is a smaller town, a couple miles away. But again, there were these health concerns about these burials being too close to where people were. I mean, there was contagious diseases and things like that people were worried about. This is another example of that same cemetery. And again, you can imagine how beautiful this was, before it was filled, but you could also imagine what it was like when all those marble monuments were bright white. And that changed as railroads came into use, acid rain began to impact on the marble. So on the right-hand side, you can see some of those are really stained black, but they were brilliant white at the time that they were placed. Then we come to religious cemeteries, and various denominations bring their own traditions to this. So there's the St. Mary's Cemetery, Catholic Cemetery in Port Jervis, and Catholics have some of the strictest rules and regulations about what monuments can look like, what they can't look like, what you're allowed to put there, what you're not allowed to put people of the Jewish faith tradition have an interesting way of honoring their dead. Every time you go to a relative who's Jewish, you leave a pebble on top of their monument, and that shows that you've been there to visit. So a lot of times you'll go to a Jewish cemetery and you'll just see every monument has pebbles and pebbles. And I like to do that no matter what tradition the person is that I'm going to visit. And I often do this at a cemetery in Port Jervis when I'm back home. And I noticed that the next year, all the pebbles have been knocked off, because I guess somebody must think that's just. We mentioned again the Moravian. This is another Moravian cemetery now. This is a little bit later. And this is a few blocks away from downtown of Nazareth, Pennsylvania. There's a bunch of cities in that northeastern corner that Pennsylvania have biblical names. Sometimes cemeteries are a little complicated to puzzle and fix. We did a walking tour of the cemetery, and I thought this was going to be a piece of cake to do this walking, until I found out that there were actually two cemeteries. Presbyterians had maybe 10 rows back from the building, and then there was a nonprofit cemetery association that owned everything after them. And so that was kind of interesting to have these meetings with the various parties that were involved with this, just to find out who owned what and who was a Presbyterian, who wasn't. And the non-Presbyterians were on this side of the line. So. These are the Clinton Cemetery is kind of fascinating because there's many prominent people buried there. So FMV is Foster M. Voorhees, who's the governor of New Jersey, the founder of and donated his land, become Foster or Voorhees State Park. There is George, I don't know how to say, it's a Greek name. He's the man, and now you'll understand why. He's the man who invented the pap smear. And so it's that long Greek name, but it's just PAP at the beginning, is how that came. And then there are other families that are notable there in Clinton. And at Clinton, I worked at the Red Mill Museum Village, and there were 5 men who started that became known as the Red Mill 5. And 2 of the Red Mill 5 are buried there, and one of them even has a picture of the mill on one. So then we come to family cemeteries, and in this case, this is the Holbert families. Only Holberts are buried there. You can't be buried there and not be a Holbert or married into the family. And they have, as you can see, an iron rail fence around it, and a sign in the middle, and then there's a big obelisk. Then there are these communal, I guess, cemeteries, I would call them. This is a combination of both a graveyard and a cemetery. So the graveyard is much older. That's behind the row of ferns there. And then there's a newer cemetery there up front. So that's kind of an interesting combination of both of those styles. Another community cemetery. This is in eastern Pennsylvania. This is the Jewish community there, and this one again, you can even see some of the pebbles on top of the monuments. In more modern times, I think I can argue this, that today's newer cemeteries are less unique, more sterile. There's less diversity in art. They are made to be more functional so that you can drive lawnmowers over them without hitting stones or cracking into stone. And so this is the George Washington Memorial Cemetery there in Bergen County, Paramus, New Jersey. And many cemeteries are moving toward this. The rules are, you're not allowed to leave, have certain plants or certain types of things there. This is a great example of that there in New Jersey. And the other thing is that more and more of us want to be cremated. And it used to be that it was, I think if you were Catholic, you were not allowed to be cremated. Other religions had that prohibition to it. And more people are being, and so there are these crematoriums like the one there that's pictured, and then there's a little box, kind of, they pull that stone off, put you in there. That's for you. Some of us want our ashes spread, like myself. Others want to be in a place like that. But my family has always tried to convince me to change my mind because they keep saying to me, "How am I going to come and visit you?" I said, "Well, you come to the Atlantic Ocean, right? That's where Kate and I is. You come out to Montana. It's a beautiful spot. I want to get right on the Continental Divide. I mean, how much more prettier can you get?" They don't like that either. So, and here's a really big one. There in Allentown. So they can this is the wave of the future. I think I read recently somewhere that 60 or 70% of people will be cremated in the decades. Another group are military cemeteries. So they're always for sad places to go to. They remind us of the price that it paid to get us to this point. The first national cemetery was at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. That's where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. The United States Military Academy at West Point is the only place in America where soldiers of every one of American wars are buried. When you go through any of these military cemeteries, it's like going through history. When you go to Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, there are 60,000 graves there representing all of America's wars as well. And then there's this one. This is the National Cemetery, the Bighorn site. The fenced-in area there is where the last group of the men of the 7th Cavalry fell, and this monument there is the there is, right where all those trees are, a national cemetery there as well. And some of Custer's scouts are buried there, and Major Reno, one of the major figures in the Custer battle, is also buried. More to home, most local cemeteries have areas that are cordoned off or allotted for military veterans. It's typical of one. This is in Port Jervis, and when I did a study of all the people that were buried here, what I found absolutely fascinating were that there were black soldiers there from the Civil War next to white officers, which just would have been unheard of in the Civil War era. But in death, they're all together there. And almost all of our nation's wars are represented there from the 19th century forward. Then there are cemeteries or graveyards at unique locations. So this Wargrove Cemetery is located at a place called Carpenter's Point. And the reason you can see is that there's 3 carpenters that were buried right at this very tip of land where 2 rivers meet Delaware. And right down there, you can see a square stone, and that's where the 3 states, New York and Pennsylvania, meet. So in that case, that cemetery has about 15,000 burials, but it's also in a unique place geographically. Then there are other unique places that we sometimes have been involved with. So the lower right was the site of a Revolutionary War battle that I've written about, menacing battle. And right underneath that rock, about 10 or 15 American militiamen were killed at the end. They've never been dug up or excavated or anything. But some of their rifles were found. Here's the left-hand side, God's little acre. And you'll often see these, particularly in urban areas, on a map, it'll say God's acre. And what it is the people that they could not find a place to bury. For example, illegitimate children, suicides, people who had murdered somebody or been murdered. And so they're usually about an acre. And also sometimes people who might have had infectious diseases, they didn't want to be buried in the city or the community. And then lastly, there's the Godfrey Cemetery. This is one man who owned thousands of acres, and this was his monument. Just put right in the middle of it. And while all that land has since been divided up, he left enough money for that to be maintained in the decades. And it's still been maintained like a state. And then there's sometimes very unique places. This was a battery manufacturing plant, and it was right along where the Delaware and Hudson Canal ran. And when I was a very young historian, the manager of this plant called me up and said, we have, and there were, just to go back, on the canal, there were thousands of mules, because there were hundreds and hundreds of boats going back and forth, you know, on the canal. And they had to have a place to bury the dead ones. You couldn't just throw them in the canal. So there was a mule burying ground in that parking lot. And so it was at the corner. And the manager called me up and said, Peter, you're the historian. We have a mule burial ground. What do we do to have to preserve it? And, you know, I'm sure you have, because all you historians have these, you know, rules and regulations. And said, so what am I going to do with the mule burying? They employed a lot of people. I'm sure he would have called my boss if I had said, you can't do anything. And I made what I think I still regret. Every time I see this slide, I still regret. I said, I think you should just pave it over. What are you worried about? No, I didn't even say like you had to put a sign there. I just said pave it over, and he did. Every time I drove by that place after that, I kept thinking about all these mules. I think they neigh. So these mules neighing in the middle of the night on the drive by. So just a couple things. When you go to cemeteries, lots of them have rules, regulations. As you can see, we're doing a cemetery tour next year as part of the 150th anniversary. But a lot of times cemeteries will not allow you to take pictures. Certainly don't want to lean on stones. I remember I was doing a tour once and somebody leaned on a stone and it flipped right over because it just wasn't stable. Sometimes they won't allow you, well, probably should allow you to have alcoholic beverages there, no vandalism. And in some places they won't allow you to take pictures. And one time I was at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, very famous people. Washington Irving is buried there. So anyway, I went through the cemetery. I did not see that sign. I came in through another entrance, took hundreds of pictures. And I got to the very end and I went into the office to buy the history of the cemetery, and there's a big sign, no photographs allowed. So that's why there's no Sleepy Hollow pictures. But that's something to pay attention to when you go. And the other thing is to be mindful of possible tragedies or problems. So some cemeteries where there's an above ground strip, you lean against that inside wall, but sometimes they'll just drop in and you'll be surprised at what you see. On the lower right-hand side, coffins were often in an earlier time made of wood, and they had a peak top to them. And after that rotted, you know, everything sunk. And so you can step, like you can see where that trench is, right in the middle there. You can step in that and go down a foot really quick, or even sometimes a foot and a half to break an ankle. Certainly you want to watch for stakes, and as I mentioned, not leaning or tipping on this. So that is my program. It is the end. Nobody found that funny? Okay. Anyway, I'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have. And hopefully when you drive around, you'll not look at cemeteries the same again. There's one just to the east of Lexington. I've forgotten what the name of it is, but there's some interesting monuments there. But I'm sure that no matter where you go, you'll find interesting monuments. Very interesting epitaphs or famous people that are buried in some of these places. I remember years ago finding where Zane Grey was buried. Now, this was a guy who was a millionaire many times over, one of the most famous American writers of all time, in this small little church cemetery, and he had a little monument. And you might not know this, but Zane Grey was a professional baseball player, and there was like 6 baseballs on it. There was all these other trinkets that people left, copies of the book, his books. He wrote about 100 books, but you never know who you'll find in some of these things. So with that, I'll take any questions. And Laura, I think you had refreshments, you said, right?
Oh yeah, there's cookies and water in the back if you're starving.
If you're starving, okay. Does anybody have any questions? I'd be glad to answer them for you. That's right. Yes.
The things that they do are very unique. we were in the Medford Mission. And it had winding black off roads along the little street. And there were little pull-outs sections that you went down this winding road. And they would have little stones or monuments there. And on a weekend, families of those buried there, yeah, and they did it regularly. I mean, it was just Sunday.
Well, I can't say that I've ever seen that, but I will say that if you read the early rules of the 19th century cemeteries, picnicking was encouraged, and you were encouraged to go on Sunday. So that's how that came to be. You were also not allowed to have firearms in a cemetery. You had to keep your horse set. I think it was like 2 miles per hour when you were in there. I think maybe it was on Sundays, you weren't even allowed to have, and you can only walk through it. So there were rules and regulations, but I think what you're talking about is something that was very common. And I know when Janice and I traveled, and one time we went, her mother was with us, and her mother was in the 80s, and we stopped at a cemetery to have lunch. We sat on a bench there at the cemetery, and her mother was Italian. And she thought that was just the craziest idea to sit and have lunch. And Janice and I did it quite a bit, so it wasn't so unusual to us. But her mom was like, you just can't eat here on this person's bench. And I said, well, why not? Well, you can. So, but I'm sure that what you're talking about is the result of what originally, how that cemetery was created. Good point. It is. Sure. Sure. Anybody? Yeah.
Do you have any idea what the thinking was behind the cemetery that didn't want you to take pictures?
I have because it was Sleepy Hollow, there are many famous people there. I mean, many famous people. So the Rockefellers are buried there. Washington Irving is buried there. The Pulitzer Prize family is buried there. And I have a feeling they didn't want people to write books or have picture books or anything like that. They wanted to reserve that for themselves. But that's the only thing I can think of. Because what can I do with those pictures? I mean, well, I have a slideshow, but I mean, and other than that, I don't know. But that one is probably one of America's, not just New York State's most famous. I mean, there's so many people. If you drove through there, you would just, oh, I know that, or I know that, that sort of thing. So the Rockefeller Monument looks like the Lincoln Memorial. It's huge, and the butler, the maid, and the Rockefeller family dog are buried outside of it. So when you walk up this pathway, they're all on the left-hand side. And I think the driver is buried there, and then the Rockefellers are all up in the south. But they're all very different. So, and everybody has their own reasons. Yeah.
Was this literally your job to go around and refurbish cemeteries, or was that just to find the?
It was a little bit of both, actually. The two that we restored, it was my job, yeah. The one with the tornado hit, I was also the city historian, and somebody had to do something. I mean, these trees were mammoth trees, and they had come down. And the president of our board raised the money to put a zigzag fence in front of it, which is what originally had been there. The one where the guy threatened to kill me, after he threatened to kill me, I said, that's probably not my job, and I probably shouldn't. But when he called me the next day and said, yeah, I'm sorry, we got off to a bad start. And I don't think he wanted Al Sharpton there either. So we did work out a deal with him in the end. And I've only been back there a handful of times since. But it was a very rural section of land. And I think he had hunters there who would abuse the privilege or whatever. And so he just didn't have people on the property, which I totally understood. And it wasn't like we were going to make it a park and be out there every day of the week or anything like that. The minister of the church, the minister of the church was so mad when he heard he was going to kill me that this is around October, so it was early October, that the minister said, that's it, we're doing an All Saints Day or All Souls Day. Was it at the end of October? I forgot. All Souls or All Saints. Okay. That's it. We're going to go out there and do a service in the cemetery. I saw a bill on it. Well, he got 15 cars to drive out there. 50 chairs. And he set this up right in the middle of the cemetery. And the guy was wondering, all these cars kept driving by his house. He came out to see what we're doing. And, the minister said a prayer and had his service. People sang hymns. And then we all drove out and that was it. But the minister didn't like the fact he threatened to kill me. So, but I would say it was a common, and I felt then, and I actually do feel that way here too, that it was part of my mission to save history. And so, and we saved both of those places. They're still, maintained. And both of them were the two oldest graveyards in the western half of the county. They both probably had burials back in the 1600s, which for our part of the world is pretty
I've
old.
always liked to walk through the graveyards and read the stones and think, wow, a whole family's here. What do you suppose happened? I kind of like it if they write it on there and I don't have to.
Well, I can tell you there is a family in Laurel Grove Cemetery, just like you would like. And it's a tragic thing though. And there was 3 daughters who all died these tragic deaths, but how they died was carved on stones. And one of the girls, and she couldn't have been more than 13 years old, had a long dress and leaned over a stove and it caught fire and burned her.
Oh.
And there was a couple other weird things too that happened. It was a German family, and that fellow probably spent all of his life savings to get those 3 stones because they were all beautiful carved limestone, marble monuments. But so right now I'm trying to. One of the things my mission is to find out why Robert Enright is buried in Rhode Island and not New York or Philadelphia. And I can't even find out what happened to him. I know that he was cremated, and at that point the story stops. His wife dies a year later, she's cremated, and then the story goes cold. So I mean, maybe they're still sitting in a box somewhere with ashes, but so that's going to be my mission to find that out. So I'm going to get dry. I'm going to wind up going to Providence, Rhode Island sometime when I'm back east and seeing what the deal is. But it's usually the cemeteries say there's a reason, like they'll say in John Kozad's case, he was buried in New Jersey first. And I don't know why, but when his wife died, she was buried Teresa died, she was buried somewhere else. They disinterred both of them, cremated whatever was left of them, and sent them up to Providence, Rhode Island. So those Kozad, well, where they had no connection. It was Johnny Kozad's wife who died, and they had a big plot. So that's why
So Peter is Robert Enright's.
she's buried she's at Laurel Hill Cemetery. Yeah. And I wish I would have known that when I was back home for Christmas. I should have gone and gotten a picture. See, that would have been dedication to my job, right? So, anyhow, yeah, she's buried at Laurel. And I don't know, she was from a pretty wealthy family, so I'm going to bet that they have a nice one there for a family. Yes.
Early in the pioneer history of this area, I would assume they buried people pretty much anywhere. With the history of the Platte River, though, when they did that, people washed out. Do you have any stories or knowledge of what might have happened?
Well, not about the Platte, but I do have a couple from back home. And this cemetery was the one I mentioned, was right on the river. And the Laurel Grove Cemetery had a flood in 1955. And the water came up and over the top of the cemetery and literally pushed graves and bodies out of the ground. And so 50 miles down the river, coffin would go floating behind. Still eyes remained to Peter Osborne, and it'd go floating, and he wound up in the Atlantic Ocean somewhere. But in other cases, bodies were just pushed out. The Civil Defense of New York was called in, and there were all these bodies laying all over the cemetery. And he ordered that all of them be buried right where they were. So you can go and think you're seeing your grandfather when it's not your grandfather at all, it's somebody else altogether. But in Port Jervis, more recently, just before I left, there was a terrible flood. And the Catholic cemetery is right on the river. And I remember I was down on the bridge that went over the river, and I saw this coffin go by. And it was pushed out. It was a more recent burial, so the ground. And the DPW, the Department of Public Works guys and I were standing there on the bridge, and this coffin goes right down underneath and goes down the river, and they found it like 20 miles south. They were hung up in trees later and brought it back and buried it. So that does happen. I mean, it's not. I don't know about the plat because people knew it flooded. It was quicksand. I don't know how many people would have actually buried that close to the river. The first burial in the Cozad Cemetery is a clay pool. Clay pool, right, Marlene? Yeah.
Yes.
And so that person was buried in September of 1873. So that's just when Cozad Colony is getting here and setting up. It was in May that they get here. Anyway, it was a daughter, or it was a wife and son. They're buried right at the edge of the cemetery where the canal is, right, Marlene? And so that, when they were digging the canal, there's some thought that they dug those people up or moved them or did whatever. And they're right by the fence. You can see them on there. But that corner, that would be the northwestern corner, very northwest of that cemetery is the oldest section. That's where the Gatewoods are very playful, and then there's some other rural settlers too. In our case, in Cozad's case, I think almost as soon as the community was, and once the Cozads got here and established, I think they had a cemetery pretty quickly drawn up and organized, and then those two, the mother and son, were buried there, and then after that, I think back east it's a little bit different because there's such a longer settlement period. I mean, you can be where I'm from, and there's burials back to the 1600s. Well, actually, I think there's Native Americans buried there, but not in a marked way. Did that answer your question?
You know,
Oh.
the oldest grave.
I don't know about Dawson, but the one that Marlene and I are talking about is the oldest one in Cozad. Yes. Gotta ask the Crystal that question. Yes.
The cemetery you were talking about on Coast.
Yeah.
A bunch of us. We asked him what the most visited grave is, and he said, Charlie Starkweather.
Oh, I didn't realize he was buried there. Okay.
And with that was, you know,
Oh, yeah.
sure.
Sure. I didn't know that he was buried there.
It just is Starkweather.
Interesting. And I'm sure that there's a lot of people buried there that we know as Nebraskans would recognize. And there's a section of that cemetery when you first come in where there's the main offices. Behind that, there are a bunch of people that died in either cholera or typhoid epidemic, because they all have the same death dates on. They're all in one section. But there's a great Holocaust memorial there at the back end of the cemetery. I mean, it's a beautiful place, and it's typical of these landscapes. And they have a great history of it too, as well. Yep.
Peter, have you ever hiked out?
No, I just see my friends from the Pearsons are here. Marlene and I are going to go out there someday. We were talking about that the last.
Or the rabbit seats.
Yes, that's what Marlene and I were talking about the other day. So I do want to get a picture of it because that's kind of typical of family graveyard. You know, there's only a handful of people buried there, and so that's what we want to get a picture just for our records. Yes.
They interested in the place where you said they had them paid over for the meal.
Yes. It's an embarrassing moment. I should never admit it.
Bothered you when you drove by? I just wanted to tell you that horses neigh and mules bray.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. And they were mules. They were not horses. So thank you. Remember that, bray and not neigh. Okay.
Peter, don't feel bad about the mules. John Knox, who is the founder of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, is buried in the parking outside the church and it's paved over. Somewhere around, they think it's somewhere around stall 2 and 3. Don't feel bad.
That's when giant concrete.
We all have
And
those.
there's no monument. There's no monument. There's no marking for the
And there's not even like something painted on the ground.
No,
you know,
there's nothing.
Don't park here.
There's nothing. You would not know.
Anyway. Okay, anybody else? And I should say, Laura, when's the next one? April?
April, gosh, it's the first Thursday of the month.
Okay.
Same.
So that-
April 7th, I
In
think.
that
Seventh,
program,
seventh?
that's
Okay.
the third of the trilogy. I like what you
Uh-huh.
call it, trilogy. We're going to be reading from the journals of Lewis and Clark. And let's see, in 2008, I traveled the route of Lewis and Clark from the Atlantic to the Pacific back. And so I was reading their journals everywhere. And so I have pictures of places that I was at and what they wrote at that moment. So that's our next program.
Peter,
Yes.
you might just mention things about cemeteries and local people. Miles Marriott.
Oh,
He
yes.
is Fairview Cemetery with his mother and dad.
Mother and dad both, yeah.
At Fairview Cemetery.
Chuck was on a mission today. He went down to take pictures of the tombstones for me. Yeah. And then Marlene and I earlier this week went out to where his house was moved to. You can
Yes.
describe that better than I can. But yeah, we're building a new exhibit on Miles Marriott at the museum. And we have about 10 of his paintings. But one of the things we found is that the information that we generally have about Miles Marriott, I won't say isn't correct, but it could use some truthifying to it. So we've been doing research, and Chuck went out there because, like, for example, one of the things that has been said at our museum, and I've said it, was that when Miles Marriott lived in our building, he and his mother, because his father was dead, ran the hotel Hendy. Well, as Chuck found out, and we knew, the father didn't die until well after 1907, and the Hendy and the Miles Marriott was almost gone from Cozad by that. I mean, there was no way he was doing that as a 30-year-old guy. He did it as a young man. So trying to make some sense and get this kind of nailed down, sure, but we're getting. But we have a bunch of his paintings we found, a lot of information about. We've got one of his dressers is coming to us that he stored the Indian artifacts and eggs in. So it's going to be taxidermy. We've got an eagle, a golden eagle. We have two. I forgot the name of the birds are with the really long beaks. Curly something or another, quills or anyway. So that's going to open on May 1st. Anybody else? Well, Laura, thanks for having me. And I'm sorry.
I've got hundreds of questions like that. But one, you could probably do a whole store or a whole series on stranger furniture.
Oh, for sure.
Ever thought of that?
I had them happen to me.
It does not, I work at a little cemetery I take care of, and it doesn't bother me being there at all, but it bothers lots of people to be there.
Mhm.
And I hear stories all the time about, at night, all the graves glow. And people swear they've seen it for years. Or other things have happened. I've never seen a thing.
I've never seen anything like that either. Although I will tell you that the police in Fort Griffith, where I'm from, drive through the cemetery every night to check on them. And they've seen women running through there in white dresses, not women, but I mean, spiritual. And it spooked some of those guys. I mean, these are rough, tough guys. But this woman will run across the road in front of them. They stop and they're jarred a little bit. So, one of the things that's popular in cemeteries these days is they'll have 10 or 15 people portray the person who's buried at a site. And so that, like if it's a mayor of the town, he'll stand there and say, well, I was mayor so-and-so, and this is what happened. So that is one, and cemetery tours at night are very popular. So we'll have to get some people out to do the Cozad one and see if the graves glow out there. So, okay.
The sprinklers would probably
Yeah.
come on.
All right, well, thanks all for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.